The project I'm going to talk about is called Advancing Dispute Resolution by Understanding the Sources of Conflict. This is a research project that I've worked on with Alex Colvin and Dion Poehler, colleagues from Cornell and Toronto. And this has been published in the ILR Review if you want to read the gory details. But it very much has a strong applied aspects to this. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on tonight. There's, hopefully what people would agree is serious research lying behind it, but I'm going to try to focus more on the practical aspects and what HR professionals, labor relations professionals, others can take forward with them in terms of work rather than research per se. And so to start, why don't we start with example that might not be too far-fetched these days, right? Think about a conflict where a coworker doesn't want to wear a face mask. And so just quickly, just think about, where do you think this conflict might be coming from? I'm not necessarily going to solicit answers at this point just to keep things going, but I'll just give you a second, just think about, what might be the root of this conflict. Okay, and hopefully I didn't bias your thinking too much, right? But my first thing is hopefully I thought of multiple sources rather than a single source. Now again, maybe I biased you by using source there in the singular, right? But I think even if I didn't, it's common for people when they're thinking about a dispute to oversimplify, and you think of like one major aspect. And really one of the most important themes here this evening is going to be thinking about the sources of conflict in an expansive, comprehensive way, and not just stopping at one source. And that's going to be important because different sources are going to point towards different interventions in terms of effectively shaping an enduring resolution, right? So there's all kinds of different possibilities we might have thought of in terms of where such a conflict might come from, right? There might be rights involved. It's my right to wear a mask. It's my right to be in a safe workplace, free of hazards. Maybe somebody's question, well, who's going to pay for this mask? People might have differing views on effectiveness. Somebody might think it threatens their masculinity. Maybe you have a personality clash where one person is very conscientious and is really engaged in terms of worrying about the health of others, and somebody else is more focused on themselves and more selfish. And you can have emotions as well, as sort of passions get inflamed around the importance of health or perceived aspects of freedom or politics or things like that, right? And so we have again, this is what I want you to be thinking about in terms of thinking about conflict and thinking exhaustively and comprehensively, and not just thinking about a single source of any kind of conflict you might face in the workplace or otherwise. So again, my opening point here is that disputes can be complicated, but now let's match that up with research and practice. My argument is research tends to be siloed, and economists focus on certain aspects of conflict, psychologists focus on other aspects, legal scholars might focus on a different aspect. And there's not a lot of people who are trying to bring this together. And that's really one of the main goals of our project, is to try to be sort of the great integrators, if you will, and try to bring together this research, right? It's not a critique of that research per se, but I think it's a limitation where the research doesn't talk to each other, and we need somebody to integrate it. And I would argue that in many cases, not all the time, I mean, there's dispute resolution professionals who are trained in a very broad way. And so I don't want to pick on everybody, but I think there tends to be, managers or dispute resolution professionals who are trained, probably based on the disciplines that they're more familiar with or the disciplines that they went through, right? And so you're trained to think of a conflict as the conflict of resources, or if you're trained in a different way, you're focused on sort of communication aspects or on emotive aspects, right? And so our argument here is that both on the research side and the practice side, there's this disconnect between the complexity of conflict in practice and sort of the siloed nature, especially in research, but also in terms of practice as well. And again, I think I've already made this point, in that then focuses our attention on specific aspects of conflict, which we think is a problem because it's going to be harder to effectively craft an enduring resolution to a conflict. And so here's a literary quote, which I think captures my perspective on this, right? It isn't that they can't see the solution. Everybody knows what the solution is. It's negotiation, or it's arbitration, or it's mediation, right? So you can't see the problem. You've already jumped to the solution because that's sort of your go-to solution. Everything can be solved by negotiation, or everything can be solved by mediation. Right? And what I want to do is have people take a step back, think more carefully about the problem, and then tailor your solutions to the nature of the problem. And if there's any Father Brown fans out there, G.K. Chesterton is actually the author of the Father Brown novel. So this is a quote from Father Brown. Okay, so our starting point here is that to really effectively resolve conflict, effectively resolve disputes, we need to tailor our interventions to the nature of a particular conflict, rather than just assuming that mediation is going to solve everything. Well, it's going to depend on the actual nature of the underlying conflict. And so what our research and what this presentation focuses on is getting you to think about explicitly recognizing the breadth of sources of a possible conflict, and then think about how to connect that to dispute resolution. So what I'm going to do is present a comprehensive model, give you a framework for thinking about broad different possibilities. Now, it's not going to be the case that I think every possible aspect of conflict is going to be indicated or present in any particular dispute, but give you sort of a broad checklist, if you will, a broad set of things to look for and think about as possibilities in diagnosing conflict, and then talk about how that can be linked to different dispute resolution approaches. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is going to be a fairly conceptual presentation. I mean, hopefully it's accessible, but it's not a case study, right? It's meant to give you a framework. Again, I hope this framework is very usable, very applicable. I think you'll be able to readily apply it on your own, and you don't need me to give you sort of a long case study. But just want to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page in terms of expectations going in here. Okay, so can't make a presentation on conflict without at least giving a definition of conflict, but that's not really the point of the presentation here. But just to make sure that we start there, right? Our definition of conflict is an apparent or latent opposition between two or more parties that results from differences that are either real or imagined, right? So there's a lot going on there. Maybe the conflict is in our mind, maybe in reality there are enough resources to go around. Sort of the classic orange rind versus orange juice problem, if you're familiar with that, right? So maybe it's an imagined conflict rather than real, right? So there's a lot going on, and we want to be intentionally broad here to have a big umbrella allow for a lot of different possibilities of conflict. But again, our point here isn't to get into semantic details on the nature of conflict. Really, it's to emphasize that it's broad, and it'd be useful to have sort of a broad checklist of things we could look for in terms of thinking about what are the foundations, what are the roots, what are the sources of a particular conflict. And that's really what our research focuses on. Hopefully we can start to see how this emerges from this list that I created, some things that I thought that might be the roots of a dispute over not wanting to wear a mask. And again, you probably had other things you could add to this list, and you can see as we go along sort of where that fits into our framework, or hopefully even better, where the multiple things you identify as sources of conflict could possibly fit. But just in terms of the list that I created, right, if there's rights involved, or if there's rules involved, or if there's resources involved, right, that's sort of one class of things that might be underlying a conflict. Right, there might be information. Different people have read different things in terms of how effective a mask might be. There might be miscommunication. Somebody thinks this applies quite broadly, even if you're in your own office with nobody else around on a Saturday morning. There's different perceptions in terms of risk, different frames of reference, different norms around, say, masculinity. And personality differences, emotions, mood can amplify and really magnify conflict, right? And so we can see sort of different types of categories emerging here. And we're going to group these to try to make it manageable. We've sort of scoured the literature, tried to think about all different possible sources of conflict, tried to be very comprehensive. And to keep it manageable, then it seems like to us things are reasonably categorized in sort of three broad categories, and there'll be subdimensions, but sort of three broad categories, which I've strategically pulled out here. The first one being what we'll call structural sources of conflict. The second category of our framework being what we'll call cognitive sources or cognitive sources of a conflict. And then the third one, sort of an academic term, psychogenic, more personality, emotions, moods, things like that. So we have this three-part framework that we submit to you. Is hopefully very useful for thinking about roots of conflict. And again, that in turn, later on in the presentation, will hopefully illustrate how that can be important in terms of then thinking about how to tailor more effective methods for dispute resolution. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time here going through these different dimensions so that if you are going to try to do this even informally in your own daily lives in the workplace, you have a better sense of what to look for, things to think about. Hopefully these categories give you sort of an easily accessible and remembered sort of framework to use. So we, again, have this three-part framework with sort of structure, context, rules, resources, institutions. That's the first dimension. A broad bucket of cognitive functioning that could include information, communications, things like that. And then psychogenic, personality, moods, emotions. We could think of structure, again, sort of being the environment, the rules, the institutions, resources, cognitive, if we want to be a little flippant to a certain extent, right? Think about what's going on in your brain as opposed to psychogenic, what's going on in your heart, or maybe what's going on in your subconscious rather than your conscious mind. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time going through each of these three categories, structural, cognitive, and psychogenic, to try to flesh out some of the meat of each of the categories. And then I will try to argue how we think this connects to important themes or important takeaways in terms of dispute resolution, conflict resolution. So again, the structural dimension is thinking about the different ways in which institutions, rules, sort of the structural nature, the context between the parties to a dispute might shape the nature of a conflict. Right, and here I think when you think about sort of the structural nature, it's tempting to sort of think about just sort of there being a conflict of interest. Right, both of us want the last piece of cake, to take sort of a trite example, right? And there's not enough to go around. But really there's alternative relationship structures that would be useful for somebody to identify and to think about in trying to diagnose the source of a conflict and better resolve a conflict. And for those of you who have experienced my textbook, this might sound familiar. These are the same models I use for thinking about different perspectives on labor markets, different perspectives on labor unions, but I think it translates nicely more generally beyond the employment relationship or beyond sort of labor management relations, think about interpersonal relationships and other types of things. So we're gonna have 4 different relationship possibilities. Again, in thinking about the nature of conflict, our argument here is that it's useful to think more explicitly about the nature of the relationship between the parties. One relationship might be really sort of self-interested. That's where the egoist label comes from here. It's all about my own self-interest, and I'll engage in a relationship, I'll exchange with somebody else if it's in my self-interest, and that person is also acting in the same way. And so if we share self-interest, we'll consummate our relationship, we'll work for each other, we'll work together on a project, whatever the case may be. When it no longer suits our self-interest, we'll go our separate ways. All right, very sort of most relationships in the workplace we'll think of as more enduring than this. This is really more sort of a typical market-based exchange way of thinking about things. But in this way, if this is really the nature of the relationship, then the conflict is probably more over the terms of the exchange and whether each of us lived up to our side of the bargain, right? The relationship itself is less important because as soon as one side or the other can serve their own self-interest more effectively in a different relationship, the relationship will be over. So it's important to think about, is that the type of relationship that's going on? Again, if it's in the workplace, it is more likely a different type of relationship. Right? A second possibility is what academics might call a unitarist relationship, unity of interest, emphasizing shared interest. Right? And I should emphasize in the remaining three structures that I'm going to present here, these are all relationships in contrast to the first one. These would all be relationships or structures where there's lasting interdependence, right? There's some reason why these parties prefer to continue to deal with each other rather than just break up and go on and work for somebody else or whatever the case may be. But even within relationships that have sort of this benefits of lasting interdependence, there's still different structural natures that might be going on. One of the possibilities, again, sort of a very idealistic mutual gain structure where it's really very much a win-win relationship. And if that's really the true nature of the relationship, then any conflicts right, are hopefully short-lived and maybe easily resolved, right? Because it's not deeply rooted in the context. It's not deeply rooted in sort of structural inequalities, for example, right? But any conflicts might be, sort of personality conflicts or interpersonal conflicts, right? That can be improved through addressing those personal aspects of the relationship, right? Maybe improving HR practices to have better alignment. Right, but it doesn't get at the fundamental, it doesn't involve the fundamental nature of the relationship. The fundamental nature of the relationship is one of win-win. Now, at the very other end of the spectrum in terms of lasting independence, instead of win-win, we could think of relationships that are more win-lose. Right? And so this might be a more antagonistic relationship where each side is trying to win, each side is trying to exercise its own power to get more for itself. At the expense of the other. But there's still something that keeps these parties bound to each other. So there's some lasting interdependence. So there has to be some degree of accommodation. If not, we're back to number one, and you can just go your separate ways. But so this would be a situation where, and I'll give you examples on the next slide. This would be a situation where it's more of a win-lose relationship, say between two coworkers or between workers and the organization, whatever the case may be, as opposed to a win-win. And then in between, sort of a mixture of number 2 and number 4 is more of a pluralist approach. Has elements of both number 2 and number 4. So there's a mixed gains element to a pluralist relationship, but it's not exclusively mutual gains. There are some issues that would be in conflict. And so we can't rely simply on win-win, but there are some win-win aspects. And so it's not completely a win-lose, right? It's really sort of a combination of the unitarist and the antagonistic. But in a pluralist relationship, we think of as everybody having legitimate interests, even if they're in conflict. So if workers have a pluralist, if we think of them as having a pluralist employment relationship, then workers' interests and organizational interests are all legitimate, even though there might be a conflict and benefits to one harms the other. Okay, and again, I've developed this way of thinking more in terms of the employment relationship, but I think this can be useful for thinking about different possibilities in lots of other types of relationships. So for example, in terms of coworkers, in an egoist relationship, again, think of it just sort of self-interested trades. For academics, maybe it's co-authors, right? We're going to work together when it's our self-interest. We have skill sets that align. We can get mutual benefits. And if I find a better co-author or the project's over, then I'll work with somebody else or I'll work on my own. in more of a traditional work setting, right? Just think of situations where two workers aren't in competition with each other. So there's no harm in not working with each other, but maybe their careers or maybe their work would benefit at certain times if they work together, right? So maybe managers from different areas, there might be times when they work together and it serves both of their interests. There's others, but not working together doesn't harm them. What does this point our attention to then in terms of thinking about resolving disputes? Well, it's all about self-interest, it's all about consent, and so those are the types of issues that a dispute resolution person should be looking at. An example of a unitrist situation might be a work team with shared rewards, and everybody does better the more productive the group is. And so then if there's disputes, right, we want to be able to focus on those mutual gains, work past the dispute so it doesn't harm the mutual gains, and the relationship is really quite key. Pluralist example could be regular and temporary employees working together. They have some things in common, right? If both regular and temporary employees are doing a good job, then presumably everybody is better off because the work is going more smoothly, fewer problems to deal with, less stress, right? So there's some things that they have in common, but there's also interests that conflict. And temporary employees might want more security, but they can't get it, or that might require regular employees giving up some of their security, or there's probably conflict in terms of pay, and regular employees probably paid better, have better benefits. Temporary employees would rather have that, but managers might see that as, well, that would have to come out of the regular employees' pockets, and so there's conflict there. So again, sort of mixed motive relationship, some interest in common, some things more conflictual. And then an antagonistic example in the workplace might be two workers who are quote unquote fighting. Competing might be a better characterization for one promotion, right? And there might be power imbalances. One person, might have better resources in the workplace, be able to be more successful for whatever reason. There might be inequalities that we would need to think about in terms of, how would we resolve this conflict? But remember, in the win-lose situation, though, there's still something that binds them together, right? So these two workers can't be too antagonistic because then they're both going to be fired, right? So there's things that would have them still, have somewhat of a relationship, would still need to be civil, would still have some interdependence, but ultimately, maybe through their own lens, it's more about serving my own self-interest at the expense of somebody else's. Okay, I'll try not to, one thing about Zoom, it's easy to just sort of talk to yourself and lose track here. I'll try and keep things moving along and end on time. So switching gears of the framework, the second dimension, the cognitive, and this is, again, sort of a overall category, trying to categorize or think about lots of things that might be going on in terms of people's brains that might be leading to conflict. Sort of four broad categories to think about, at least quickly. One is cognitive frames, sort of an academic term, just thinking about it as sort of mental maps, if you will, knowledge structures, right? It's the way that our brains process information. We create these mental maps, which we then use to interpret new events and new information, provides a basis for perception, and that translates into action. Well, how can this cause conflict? Well, our cognitive frames develop over time, a product of our history, our own experiences. And so, my cognitive frame develops differently from yours. We have different expectations. Maybe I see our relationship as win-win and you see it more as win-lose. And so we have a conflict because we have different expectations, different perceptions about our relationship, or different expectations, different preferences over lots of different things. I'm more risk averse than you are. You have a much stronger preference for fairness than I do. Maybe different employees, maybe if you're managing different employees, I had this own experience myself, managing different employees, some who viewed money in terms of salary through a very different lens. And I have people in my department who I manage. Some of them were trained more as economists, and they see money much more impersonal and instrumental, sort of salary shaped by impersonal market forces, and have sort of organizational behavior psychologists in my department who have very different trainings, very different frames of reference, and they see money in terms of salary as more of an indication of their self-worth rather than sort of this impersonal market-driven phenomena. And so it creates conflict when we have these very different, or can create conflict when we have these different expectations, different preferences. Information can be interpreted differently because we're coming at it through different frames. This can be magnified when there's unexpected events because we're not familiar with this, and so it just increases the risk that we interpret things in different ways or misinterpret things, right? So all of a sudden you're acting in a different way. We're faced with a new situation and I don't really know how to interpret my coworkers' actions, and maybe I interpret their actions as, you know, being really selfish or self-interested or instrumental, and that's not really what's going on, but it's just sort of unexpected, and I'm not really making the best interpretation of what's going on, and that can cause conflict as I accuse my coworker of being selfish when that's not really how they think of their own actions. And this is where culture fits into our framework. I don't want to sort of overemphasize culture. Doesn't mean that culture always causes conflict, but it certainly can. And this slots into our framework through cognitive frames, and that, you know, culture can shape your frames, your preferences, what's important. You know, different cultures emphasize the importance of saving face more than other cultures. Some cultures are more individualistic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? We can just think of those as different frames and can cause conflict in the ways that I've been describing already. Another aspect of cognition is processing information. There's different ways in which this can contribute to a conflict or be the source of a conflict, right? Research documents how we process information in limited ways, right? Instead of being pure, you know, excessively rational, like mainstream economists like to assume, right? The research is, you know, the human brain is confronted with so much information that we take shortcuts. We suffer from cognitive biases like anchoring or overconfidence. We can also, you know, maybe we're motivated differently. And so I'm, you know, really invested in a certain problem, really passionate about a certain issue. And so I'm really motivated to search out a lot of information, and you don't have that same motivational level for this particular project or this particular issue, right? And so you don't find the same sources of information that I do. And so we might have a clash. We can also be impulsive in our information processing and not always consistent, which can cause conflict, right? Yesterday you said this, or you had this stance, and today I'm doing this, right? Because I'm processing information inconsistently over time. Another aspect of cognition is in-group and out-group perceptions. The social identity theory you've probably heard of. Lots of research showing how humans naturally sort of magnify the positive characteristics of groups that we belong to or see ourselves as belonging to, and magnifying the negative qualities of individuals or groups that we don't align ourselves with. And so this magnification of perceptual differences can cause conflict between individuals or between groups. Right? A lot of this can be magnified by cognitive biases. You know, we suffer from confirmation bias, and, you know, we have this preconceived notion of somebody who's in a different social group than we are, and we just sort of, you know, we interpret evidence through a lens of reinforcing our preconceived notions rather than combating them. Another category, under cognition, is miscommunication. A quick comic here. This is a comic called Zits, and one of them is this teenage boy who's in the comic, right? And he's with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend says, "Jeremy, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'd like to run something by you that may really bring us closer, can deepen and improve our communication," right? That's what she's saying. right? And what does the teenage boy here? Run. All right, so hopefully this is, albeit a gender stereotype, sorry about that, but hopefully it's a humorous way of thinking about miscommunication. There can be cultural aspects to this, right? So in negotiations, it might be common to table a proposal. Why do I introduce this here? Well, if you're British as opposed to American, tabling something has exactly the opposite implication. It can be very confusing when it means exactly the opposite thing in British English as opposed to American English. Now we look at different theories of communication. I don't want to get into this at this point, but no matter what theory of communication you look at, what it reveals is there's lots of scope for misinterpretation, right? And so that can be another aspect that contributes to a conflict and something that should be taken seriously. In labor relations in particular, there can be multiple audiences for messages. Negotiators are talking across the table with the people they're bargaining with, but they're also trying to send signals to constituents like the rank and file or higher level management. And so that just increases the chance that messages will be misinterpreted and lead to conflict. Okay, and just quickly, the third dimension, the psychogenic dimension, right? These are conflicts that either cause or maybe even more likely just get magnified by sort of these affective reactions, right? These visceral reactions, these emotional reactions. And so we just break this into two broad categories, emotions and moods. Here's an excerpt from an old Dilbert cartoon. Stereotypical portrayal of the evil HR director here. When I'm in a bad mood, I like to think of ways to humiliate employees, right? Emphasizing or making light of the fact that some people, right, when they're in a bad mood, they take it out on other people, and that can obviously be a source of conflict. There's lots of ways in which emotions and moods can cause conflict. Right, hard emotions can create sort of this fight or flight reaction. Your subconscious takes over, leads potentially to sort of aggressive responses rather than thoughtful responses or reasonable responses. When you're sort of confronted with somebody else acting very negatively or confrontationally towards you, some people call that emotional flooding, right? And your brain sort of freezes up, and there's a tendency to sort of lash out rather than to sort of process things more reasonably or more rationally. And then to tie this back to the cognition dimension, mood can just affect information processing and decision making. And so people who are happy might make riskier decisions. And so again, sort of day to day, you're dealing with the coworkers. Someday they're happy, someday they're not, right? And there can be conflict because some days they're making riskier decisions or sort of putting forth riskier alternatives or supporting riskier alternatives than other days. And then there can also be personality conflicts, right, different levels of neuroticism or extroversion, right? Think about how sort of a extrovert and introverted person deal with each other. Maybe they have differing expectations. One wants to talk more, one wants to talk less, just to be very simplistic. Different levels of conscientiousness can be an obvious source of conflict among coworkers or work groups or student teams. Right, so probably don't need me to work very hard to convince you that personality can also be a source or a way that magnifies conflict that comes from other sources. Okay, and we can see this in the debates over masks. The unfortunate reality of today, right? People having somewhat visceral reactions, right? Equating it to tyranny and fascism and all kinds of nasty things, right? And so this might not be the initial source of a conflict, but the emotions and the personality sort of magnifies and amps things up and makes it more difficult to resolve these conflicts. Okay, so keeping an eye on time here, right, just to recap, we think it's useful to think about three sort of broad categories of sources of conflict. Again, not all of them are necessarily going to be present in every single conflict, but we think in order to really get a very deep handle on what's going on in any particular situation, I think it's good to sort of be primed to be thinking about a broad list of possibilities. You can rule some of them out, but it's better to sort of think about them and reject them than to not even think about them and miss them. And so we think hopefully this is a useful framework for thinking about. And again, the implication here is that we should be really trying to put a specific situation under a microscope or a magnifying glass if we want to be literal, and really analyze and diagnose the conflict. Why? This isn't just, to be curious, oh, what's going on here, right? But it's really to get to the key point here is that the nature of conflict is going to shape the nature, or should shape the nature, of a dispute resolution intervention, right? So an arbitration hearing is probably a poor way to resolve a personality conflict. Negotiation might be a poor way to resolve a conflict that's rooted in miscommunication if people just, keep talking past each other and, there's no intervention to figure out what the source of the miscommunication is. So we can think broadly about three categories of conflict resolution methods, sort of institutions and rules, negotiation, and different third-party methods, arbitration, mediation being the two basic examples there. I imagine people are quite familiar with those in general. So I'm just going to skip ahead or sort of turn quickly to how we see these different sources tying into some different aspects of these different categories of dispute resolution methods. Okay, so in terms of diagnosing conflict and tying it back to dispute resolution methods, you should be identifying the structural nature of a conflict. Again, thinking about what type of relationship is at play here. And then what does that imply about dispute resolution? Well, if it's more of a self-interested relationship, maybe focus on, what the alternatives are. Hey, look, you should get along in this relationship because you really don't have any better alternatives. Or as opposed to a unitrist relationship where you should really be focusing on alignment, focusing on respect for legitimacy and trying to find some balance where nobody consistently loses all the time in a pluralist relationship, or trying to disentangle these very complex power dynamics when it's more of a win-lose antagonistic relationship. And connecting this to different forms of dispute resolution more explicitly, right? With an egoist, maybe there's rules to promote sort of smooth exchange in our relationship, making sure what it is that I have to fulfill in our relationship, what it is that you have to fulfill, and maybe an arbitrator can be a very efficient way of resolving any disputes in terms of, did we both live up to our ends of the bargain? Whereas in a unitrist structure, where the relationship is really important, maybe mediation, integrative bargaining would be more important. Pluralist might introduce arbitration for the win-lose part, and antagonistic, right? That's going to point typically more towards distributive negotiation, maybe rules to keep us from abusing our power too excessively, arbitration to resolve these conflicts of interest, right? So different types of relationship might point to different types of negotiation, different types of third-party interventions. Whereas in terms of cognitive challenges, right, different strategies you might apply in terms of cognitive aspects of conflict, right? If it's about people being stuck in different frames, you try to think about how can I unfreeze our different frames, change them so they become more consistent with each other, and then refreeze them in a more productive space where they're more aligned, say, around a shared vision of our relationship. There can be interventions in terms of stereotypes. We can be trained to be more aware of our own cognitive biases. There can be interventions to diagnose communication issues. We can develop criteria for evaluating alternatives if we're interpreting information or prioritizing information differently. And again, this points to different dispute resolution methods. Mediation might be particularly well suited for the first 4 bullets here. Negotiation might help us evaluate different sources of information. Integrative bargaining in particular embraces the principle of developing objective criteria for evaluating different alternatives. So again, different cognitive aspects, pointing in different dispute resolution directions. Quickly, in terms of psychogenic conflicts, a lot of this is just being aware of the importance of emotions and moods and personalities, maybe taking a step back if things are very heated, employing a cooling off approach, maybe some counseling, recognizing what's important, providing opportunities for face saving, for example, to address some emotional issues. And again, some of these are going to be, some of these aren't going to be handled very well through, for example, arbitration or even negotiation. It might require more transformative mediation approaches or more intentional mediation approaches. So we can't just always have arbitration, say, as the default dispute resolution method in our organization, because it's not going to handle the psychogenic aspects of conflict, for example. Okay, so to start to wrap up here, this really tries to just reinforce what I've been saying for a little while here. We call this managing conflict at its sources, right? Not just jumping to, I'm familiar with mediation, or I'm a good mediator, I'm always going to do that, or I see everything through an arbitration lens, right? But really taking a step back, diagnosing conflict, and let that tailor the dispute resolution method. So different types of relationship might point in different directions, different cognitive aspects point to different types of strategies, different psychogenic aspects also point to alternative approaches. Again, this is sort of reinforcing what I've been saying already, but just for emphasis, right, we can only get to this point, or we're more likely to get to this point if we really take a step back and are very purposeful and intentional in terms of diagnosing conflict and thinking about the cognitive possibilities, the psychogenic and the structural possibilities. Okay, so almost at the finish line here, to try to finish things up. Hopefully I've made all these points already, but just for reinforcement, we don't think that dispute resolution methods are tailored explicitly enough, or enough thought is given to how we need to connect dispute resolution methods to the underlying sources of a conflict, sources plural in many cases. And so hopefully this three-dimensional framework is useful for thinking about a wide variety of possible aspects of conflict. Don't want to sort of oversimplify how these things happen in practice, right? It can be hard to disentangle these different aspects, but I'm a big believer in, sort of exploding things to put things back together, or, breaking things into manageable pieces, different things to watch for, so we can get a handle on the underlying pieces and put things together, even if it's very complicated to do that. This also helps us think about whether a resolution is temporary. So for example, one potential resolution in air quotes to the mask problem is the organization can just order the employee to wear a mask, right? And in some superficial way, or in some visible way, that might seem to resolve the conflict because the employee is wearing the mask, right? But if there's these underlying issues that are festering, does it really resolve the conflict, or does it just sort of, put it on hold and it's just going to sort of flare up again, maybe in a more destructive way? And so to think more deeply about the broad roots of conflict can help you really resolve a conflict rather than just sort of superficially resolve it. And so then at an organizational level, this also means that we need to be very flexible in terms of how organizational dispute resolution systems are designed, so it can encompass a broad range of disputes. I don't think any of us are wise enough to fully comprehend all of the different combinations of sources of conflict that we'll see in our organizations. So we have to be broad in designing organizational dispute resolution systems. Okay, just to make sure this is on the video, contact information for anybody who's watching this later. If anybody really wants to see how the sausage was made and get into the details, we published an article on this year. But really the closing thoughts I want to leave you with, again, are the importance of diagnosing the roots of conflict in a very intentional way, and then thinking about what that implies for probably a multidimensional approach to resolving disputes. Thanks.